Some bad NBA trades are just simple miscalculations. You misread a player's age. You overestimate a roster fit. You convince yourself one new piece can save an old core. But some trades go way beyond a bad bet. They do not just weaken a team for a season. They bend the direction of an entire franchise, hand its future to someone else, and years later, fans still look back at them like they are watching a legally approved act of self-destruction. Because the worst trade is not always the one that looked the dumbest on the day it happened. Sometimes the real damage shows up later when the player you gave away becomes a Hall of Famer, an MVP, the face of an era, or simply the player who should have belonged to your team. And once that happens, the trade stops being a front office decision. It becomes a scar in franchise history. The Lakers are usually remembered as the franchise of superstars, blockbuster steals, and a near supernatural ability to pull the brightest spotlight back toward themselves. But in 1979, they made a move that in hindsight feels like the kind of decision you only make when you believe you see something nobody else sees. The problem is this time, they saw it wrong. They sent 23-year-old Adrian Dantley to Utah for Spencer Haywood, a much bigger name at the time, but also a much older player. And sometimes the age gap tells you almost the entire story. Dantley was not some raw project who needed years of patience. He was already Rookie of the Year. He had already proven he could score efficiently. He already looked like a high-level offensive player moving toward his prime. The Lakers basically looked at an ascending asset and traded it for a player much farther down the career curve. Yes, the Lakers won the 1980 championship. That softens the way this trade gets remembered. But that is also the trap of judging a deal only by the short term. Dantley did not disappear after leaving Los Angeles. He exploded in Utah, became one of the most efficient scorers in the league, won scoring titles, made multiple All-Star teams, and eventually entered the Hall of Fame. In other words, the Lakers did not just trade a young player. They traded away years of elite production that should have been part of their future. That is the kind of trade that can look survivable if you only study one season. Look farther and it becomes something much colder. A reminder that even great franchises can hand their future to somebody else. If the Lakers trade was the kind of mistake that comes from swapping youth for age, the Bulls' mistake hurts on a different level. They actually got their hands on the right asset, then chose to let it go. And that is always the kind of mistake fans remember the hardest. Because you cannot blame bad luck. You cannot say the opportunity never came. The opportunity was already in the room. In 2006, Chicago held the rights to LaMarcus Aldridge, a highly regarded big man, with the kind of offensive and defensive profile that already looked like long-term franchise material, but instead of keeping him, the Bulls pivoted toward Tyrese Thomas. At the time, the move could be framed as strategic, a front office convincing itself it was getting the better fit, the better upside, the better direction. But history does not care how teams explain a move to themselves in the moment. History cares about what the player actually becomes. And Aldridge became exactly what teams spend years trying to find: an all-star level, big, durable, reliable, polished, capable of carrying real scoring weight and anchoring a franchise for years. He did not just become good, he became foundational. Meanwhile, Chicago never got anything close to equal value back. Tyrese Thomas had flashes, he had athleticism, he had moments where people talked themselves into the idea that maybe it would all come together. But he never became the kind of player who makes a franchise look smart for passing on someone like Aldridge. And that is why this one lingers. The Bulls did not miss on a hidden gem late in the draft. They did not get beaten to him by somebody else. They had Aldridge. Then they made the decision that they did not want him. In the world of all-time bad NBA trades, that is a special kind of pain, not failing to find the future but handing it back yourself. But if LaMarcus Aldridge was a cornerstone, Chicago chose to walk away from Indiana's story cuts in a different way. They did not just almost have the right player. They drafted him, and then immediately decided that the safety of the present mattered more than the risk of the future. In 2011, the Pacers selected Kawhi Leonard with the 15th pick. That matters because it means this is not just a hindsight story where people later pretend the answer was obvious. Indiana saw enough to call Kawhi's name. They just did not believe strongly enough to keep him. Instead, they sent Leonard's rights to San Antonio for George Hill, a steadier, more familiar guard who made more immediate sense for a team trying to stabilize its backcourt. And in the short term, the logic was not crazy. Hill was a good player. He could handle the ball score enough to defend his position and help a team feel more settled right away. It is exactly the kind of move a franchise can talk itself into when it wants to become respectable faster. But the cold truth about trades like this only appears when time starts telling the full story. In San Antonio, Kawhi did not just develop well. He became the kind of player almost every franchise dreams of, finding a truly rare two-way wing who could erase stars on one end, score efficiently on the other, carry playoff possessions, and eventually rise into a genuine championship centerpiece. Defensive Player of the Year. Finals MVP. The face of the Spurs' next era after Duncan. Once a player reaches that level, every explanation that sounded reasonable on draft night starts collapsing fast. George Hill was not a bust. That is what makes this trade hurt more. If he had been terrible, the story would be simpler. But because Hill was useful, this trade became the most painful kind of mistake, trading a good player for a player who could reshape franchise history. Indiana chose stability. San Antonio chose upside. Years later, the gap between those two choices looks like the gap between a reliable starter and a real playoff legend. Then comes one of the most famous draft night wounds in NBA history. Charlotte drafted Kobe Bryant, then watched him become a Los Angeles legend before he ever played a single minute for them. That is what keeps this trade alive forever. Not because Charlotte gave away some normally good player, but because they were the team that actually held Kobe's rights at the beginning. They were the franchise that could have said, "This is our future." Instead, they sent Bryant's rights to the Lakers for Vlade Divac, an experienced center, a much safer immediate piece, and a player who made more sense if your priority was winning sooner rather than later. And to be fair, this was not a completely insane decision if you freeze yourself in 1996. Kobe was only 17. A high school guard back then still felt like a real gamble to a lot of front offices. Divac was a proven center who could stabilize a team right away, and Charlotte did get real short-term value out of that. This was not the kind of trade where everybody instantly screamed that a franchise had ruined its future. That is actually what makes it hurt more over time. It is the kind of move that looks understandable at first, then slowly turns into a historical nightmare. Because on the other side, this was not just a good career. This was Kobe Bryant. 20 years with the Lakers, 5 championships, an MVP, a permanent place in the highest tier of NBA history. Not just a star, but a cultural symbol. A franchise symbol, one of the defining faces of an entire basketball generation. Once the outcome gap gets that massive, every short-term argument falls apart. If Kobe is the kind of pain that comes from letting a future icon slip away, Milwaukee's Dirk Nowitzki trade feels even colder in one specific way. It feels like an entire era got handed to another franchise in the space of a few draft night minutes. In 1998, the Bucks controlled Dirk Nowitzki's draft rights. They were the team in position to keep one of the rarest European prospects the league had ever seen at a time when the NBA still was not fully comfortable with the idea of a tall forward who could shoot, move, stretch the floor, and quietly change what offensive basketball could look like. But instead of keeping Dirk, Milwaukee sent his rights to Dallas in the deal involving Robert Tractor Traylor. At the time that move could be sold as the more practical choice, the more traditional big, the safer fit, the kind of body and style the league still trusted more. The problem is that some trades do not die on the day they are made. They sit there quietly until the player on the other side fully becomes himself. And once Dirk became Dirk, the gap between both sides stopped being about fit. It became the gap between short-term rotation value and a legend who could define an entire franchise. Dirk did not just succeed in Dallas, he became Dallas. He became the face of an era, a one-of-one superstar, an MVP, a champion, a finals MVP, and the kind of player who becomes more closely tied to a team than even the logo sometimes feels. That is why this trade is not just about Milwaukee picking the wrong player. It is deeper than that. The Bucks got their hands on a player who could define a generation, then handed him to somebody else to build a monument around. And what makes it linger is that Dirk did not explode for a few seasons and fade. He stayed for more than 2 decades, like a living reminder that some draft night mistakes never actually disappear. They just grow older with history. Oklahoma City is one of the clearest examples. When the Thunder sent James Harden to Houston, they were not trading some ordinary bench scorer. They were trading a young piece who had just helped power a finals run and was standing right on the edge of something much bigger. The motivation sounded familiar and reasonable on paper: manage the payroll, avoid long-term financial strain, preserve flexibility. But in the NBA, there are moments when saving money is really just another way of paying for the death of a dynasty before it fully exists. Harden got to Houston, received the keys, and became an MVP, a scoring champion, and the offensive engine of an entire era. The Thunder did not collapse overnight, but they lost the chance to see Durant, Westbrook, and Harden mature together into whatever their final form might have been. And there is no spreadsheet that can fully recalculate that loss. Brooklyn made a different kind of mistake, but one just as punishing. They mortgaged the future for a contention window that looked bigger from the outside than it really was on the inside. The trade that brought Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett from Boston to Brooklyn was the kind of deal that feels heavy the second you read the price. Unprotected first-round picks, swap rights, years of draft control pushed out the door for two stars whose names still carried enormous weight, but whose career clocks were already running low. Brooklyn was not irrational for wanting it. The franchise had just moved, wanted immediate relevance, wanted a headline, wanted to win now. But in the NBA, the distance between wanting a window and actually having one can be brutally expensive. Brooklyn's closed almost as soon as it opened. And while the Nets spent years boxed in by the cost, Boston used those same assets to seed its next era. That is the kind of trade where one team does not just lose the deal, it helps pay for the other team's rebirth. Then there is Dallas and Luka Doncic, a trade so modern it still feels unsettled. Because when you trade Luka, you are not just trading a star. You are trading your own solar system. A player still under 25, already stacked with all-NBA first-team honors, already a finals centerpiece, already a record breaker, already proven to be one of the rarest heliocentric offensive forces in modern basketball. Players like that are supposed to be untouchable. You keep them, build around them, and live with every consequence that comes with that choice. Instead, Dallas moved him. Whatever logic can be presented about roster balance, health defensive structure, or timeline management, the foundation never changes. Players like Luka almost never get traded at that age. That is why the shock hit so hard. It was not just bad value. It felt like a break from the most basic rule of franchise building. If you have a generational offensive genius, you do not look for his replacement. You win with him or fail with him, but you do not hand him to someone else. 3 trades, 3 eras. Same haunting truth. Some front offices do not lose because they lacked talent. They lose because they personally signed the papers that moved it to the other side. And maybe that is the real definition of a franchise's worst trade. Not just a deal that costs you a few games, a playoff spot, or a season or two of adjustment, but a decision that keeps coming back years later, haunting everything. Every Hall of Fame speech, every championship won somewhere else, every time fans look back at the draft board, the lost picks, or the name that should have become the face of their own team. Adrian Dantley, LaMarcus Aldridge, Kawhi Leonard, Kobe Bryant, Dirk Nowitzki, James Harden, Luka Doncic. These names are not just examples of talented players who got traded away. They represent futures that were once in a franchise's hands, then deliberately signed over to somebody else. And that is what makes these deals hurt longer than almost any on-court failure. A loss passes, a bad season ends, but the feeling of "we used to have him" can survive for decades. That is why trades like these are not just front office mistakes. They are historical fractures, moments where a team did not simply lose a player, it lost the best version of its own future.